I had it up to about to here with all this quarantine nonsense. You know who I think started all this? Carol Baskin.
Mr. Phelps's class. Yeah.
Good morning, freshmen. Hope you had a good spring break and you're back up and early and alert enough this morning to be able to jump back into school. I know it's a tough transition coming off of something like that back into something like school that's a little more scheduled. I have a tough transition with it too sometimes. But we'll make it through it together. So, just as a reminder of what we were working on before spring break, we just read a couple pieces from the Age of Enlightenment, and again, as a reminder, this was a time, especially in America, of kind of a lack of appetite for fictional writing, and that, of course, drives a lot of what writers tend to write, and so if people don't want it, or there's like this kind of cultural shift away from it, saying it's not important, we shouldn't use it right now, then nobody's going to write it, or at least very few people are going to write it. That doesn't mean that there wasn't any fictional writing at all, of course. There was, I'll show you an example here. There was a person named Jonathan Swift, who's also, by the way, famous for writing a lot of nonfiction stuff that we may end up getting to before the end of the year. But this is Gulliver's Travels. You might have seen a movie. I think Jack Black did a version of this. But basically where a guy falls asleep and wakes up and he's this giant in a town or a city called Lilliput. I'm not going to make us read the whole thing because it's tough to read. It's an older piece, obviously between 16 and 1800. I think that it was late 1700s when it was written. But this is a challenging piece. Let me just read the first couple sentences here, starting right here. This is like an author's note. It says, "My father had a small estate in Nottinghamshire. I was the third of 5 sons." All right, that's sentence one. "He sent me to Emmanuel College in Cambridge at 14 years old, where I resided 3 years and applied myself close to my studies. But the charge of maintaining me, although I had a very scanty allowance, became too great for a narrow fortune. I was bound apprentice to Mr. James Bates, an eminent surgeon in London, with whom I continued 4 years, and my father now and then sending me small sums of money, I laid them out in learning navigation and other parts of the mathematics useful to those who intend to travel, as I always believed it would be some time or other my fortune to do." Period. Okay. Big old sentence, right? It's not terribly challenging, but it is completely. It's a style that just continues on through the whole novel. It's not a short story. It's a novel. And the reason I wanted to show you that and not read a big portion of it was because it's, just to get a taste of that style of like this sort of writing where you start a line of thought and then you shift off to that other line of thought, and then that thought leads you to another thought, and that thought leads you to another thought, but you really never finished your very first thought until the very end of this gigantic sentence. I find that very difficult to read. And so I just wanted to show you a real quick example of this. Jonathan Swift was Irish, so it's not, incredibly different from American writing, but certainly they had their own culture and their own time and their own concerns. That being said, this was a style of fiction that would have been written during that time. If we look at those sorts of things, we read Jonathan Edwards and we read Benjamin Franklin. It was all about a focus on personal growth, personal improvement. What can we do to better ourselves? What can we do to become more like Jesus, or to become more moral, or become closer to perfection, as Benjamin Franklin would have put it? So these are again not a lack of appetite for anything frivolous, meaning that anything that was sort of in the way of getting to closer to perfection. And fiction would have been in that boat for people in this time. They didn't want it as much. If we shift over to Romanticism, which is, if we look at Age of Enlightenment being about a 200-year period between 1600 and 1800, we go to Romanticism, which is 1800 to 1865, roughly. Again, these are pretty gray area dates. But right before the Civil War, then suddenly the appetite changed. People wanted fanciful stories. They wanted storytelling, and they started to find value in it. And so, therefore, people who were already writing fiction, or people who had never considered to write fiction, started to see the value in it as well, and they started to produce much, much more. Again, we're gonna actually read several stories out of this era. This is I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's definitely one of my favorites. This is a very enjoyable one. This is easily in my top two movements of literature. So, but some important places that it made famous: the invention of science fiction, horror, and detective stories. These are heavy symbolism and deep meaning. These are sometimes challenging to read as well. But if you kind of dig in and know that that's coming, then it's not as bad. I am going to have us read a Edgar Allan Poe story today called The Black Cat, and I'll post this into OneNote in the handout section. It's a little hefty. It'll take you a little bit of time to read, and so essentially I'm going to post this and post the questions, but I'm not going to make the questions due until tomorrow's class. Okay, but I would like you to respond in Microsoft Teams with your answers to these questions. I also don't want you to write a whole essay about these. So the questions, if they can be answered in 1 or 2 sentences, then go ahead and answer them in 1 or 2 sentences. But again, don't stress too much over it. I'm going to spend today reading The Black Cat. If you've never read Edgar Allan Poe before, I think you're in for a little bit of a treat. He's an interesting and interesting guy in real life, and a creepy writer for sure. So read through The Black Cat. You can begin to work on the questions, but I'll give you some time tomorrow to do that as well, and then post those in Microsoft Teams on today's discussion board. All right, take care. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Mr. Phelps's class. Yeah.